Welcome to the Church of the Irreverent Funk. Yeah!
What if one song could explain an entire religious upbringing? What if there was an invisible system called the machine, teaching a child how to think, how to feel, how to doubt, how to repress, and ultimately who he was allowed to become? Right by Design isn't just the opening track of my Proud Heretic album. It's the blueprint, the operating system. It's the DNA of everything that follows. Hi, it's Shamrocker again. Welcome to the Proud Heretic channel. This is the perfect opportunity to establish the identity of this Proud Heretic album series. And this is in reference to my album that came out last May, all of which I wrote, composed, recorded, edited, mastered, the whole thing. And what I would like to do is begin a series here of a deep dive analysis into the lyrics and the meaning behind the art of this album. Having said that, this is not primarily a lyrical breakdown, for there are lots of those out there. Rather, this is something much more compelling. This is an autobiographical deconstruction documentary told through one song at a time in the form of satirical musical art. Now, you might resonate with my story, so I offer it here. I deliberately appeal to multiple audiences: former evangelicals, progressive Christians, seeking Christians, questioning believers, religious trauma survivors, thoughtful conservatives willing to engage, and people who enjoy psychological and literary analysis. In this first episode, we'll discover why does the album begin here? What is the infallible groove machine? How do high control religious systems quietly teach us how to think, feel, doubt, and belong? Why can certainty become more dangerous than curiosity? And what does Boy Blue represent archetypically and psychologically? How do shame, conformity, and social expectations become internalized? So just by way of introduction, let me analyze this segment.
Welcome to the Church of the Irreverent Funk. Yeah!
Welcome, saints and stakeholders. Please keep your doubts in the lobby. Compliance is next to godliness. We are the infallible groove machine. Holly fucking hallelujah. Get the funk out. Get the funk out. Hey! 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 Get the funk out.
And so by way of introduction, why does the album start here? Because if you only listen to the lyrics, this feels like a satire. A funky little jab, perhaps, at evangelical culture. Almost funny, almost absurd. But underneath the biting humor, this song is something else entirely. It isn't really about church per se. It isn't even really about religion per se. It's about systems that seek to control and dominate one's mind, body, and emotions. I am speaking from firsthand experience, having spent 47 years or most of my life in evangelical Christianity. As I've gone onward in my journey, I no longer affiliate with the label Christian anymore. So I am speaking as someone who lived it, was in it to win it, and now has come out of it damaged with religious trauma, and who is now in therapy and working through the issues. That is exactly what the infallible groove machine represents. The religious, cultural, and political systems that quietly tell us who we must become, whom we must love, and what we must believe, and punish us when we step beyond those boundaries. Now, every character that you'll meet on this album, Boy Blue, Paper Pope, and Mega Man, and even the protagonist Shamrocker, they're all born right here. Not because they're any one individual specifically, but they're many individuals. They're archetypes of a world I once inhabited, and they're a reflection of who I've become in the process from then till now. I came from a world where certainty was rewarded. Questions were dangerous, bodies were suspicious, and difference was threatening. And belonging always came with conditions. The funny thing is, when you're growing up inside a system like that, it doesn't feel like a system. It feels like reality, like gravity, like water to a fish. You don't wake up one morning and decide, I think I'll internalize shame. I think that might be a good thing. Nobody volunteers for that. It just becomes the background music of one's life. Eventually, you stop hearing it. That's why I called it the infallible groove machine. Because grooves are funny things. In music, a groove keeps pulling you back to the same beat. And I know this as pretty much a lifelong musician myself. A groove is repetitive, predictable, comfortable. You almost stop thinking about it. And psychologically, belief systems can work much the same way. You see, they create mental grooves, emotional grooves, spiritual grooves. You don't merely believe certain ideas. Eventually, those ideas start believing you. They tell you what is safe, what's dangerous, who belongs, who doesn't, who's saved, who's lost, us versus them, so on and so forth. What deserves love, what deserves shame. And this happens long before you ever stop to ask whether any of it is actually true. That's why the music matters just as much as the lyrics. I wanted this song to sound fantastic, smooth, sophisticated, even joyful, because that's how these systems often feel from the inside. They're polished, confident, organized. They promise certainty, purpose, community, answers. The groove feels so good that you forget to ask where it's taking you. The contrast is intentional. The arrangement pairs a polished gospel funk groove with lyrics that slowly expose the controlling assumptions beneath it, making the music itself part of the storytelling. Now, looking back, I don't think the greatest harm that fundamentalism did to me was teaching me the wrong answers. It was teaching me the questions I was not allowed to ask. Because once curiosity becomes a threat, growth becomes impossible. Because you just remain stagnant in dogma.
We will cancel your existence!
And if your identity depends on never questioning, then certainty becomes less about truth and more about personal survival. This song isn't my deconstruction, not yet. This is the world before the cracks started forming, or before the dominoes started falling one by one. The machine is still running perfectly. Everyone is smiling, everyone is singing, everyone thinks they're free. And honestly, so did I. So during this series, I want to show you why this isn't just the opening track of the album. It's the owner's manual for an entire worldview, which used to be my worldview. Because once you can see the machine, you start recognizing it everywhere. This episode isn't merely about dissecting lyrics. It's about uncovering the hidden architecture behind the rest of the album. So as we cue the first lyric here, let's begin analyzing the preacher's introduction.
Welcome.
Welcome to the Church of the Irreverent Funk. Yeah!
Now, let me hasten to say here, again, this album is not about attacking faith. It's attacking a particular relationship to faith and how high control religious systems manufacture a false certainty. So here we see the lyric, "Welcome to the Church of the Irreverent Funk." Yeah. Now that's an odd way to begin an album. The preacher welcomes us to the Church of the Irreverent. Now, at first glance, it sounds like the song is announcing some kind of anti-Christian sentiment, but I can assure you that was not my intention. It might sound like it's mocking church, mocking God, mocking religion, but that's actually not what's happening. The irony is that the irreverence isn't coming from the narrator. It's coming from the machine. Because if there's anything genuinely irreverent, it's claiming certainty where humility would be more appropriate. It's wrapping human opinions in divine authority. It's confusing our interpretation with God's voice, or the voice of the divine. When I was growing up, reverence meant speaking carefully about God. Today, I think reverence also means speaking carefully when we claim to be speaking for God. Those aren't the same thing. One is worship, and the other can become undue or irreverent presumption. When you look throughout history, some of the greatest harm done in the name of religion or God didn't begin with people saying, I have an opinion. It began with people saying, God agrees with me. And once that happens, compassion is over, because you can't debate certainty. You can't reason with infallibility. You certainly can't vote against God. That's why the preacher sounds so confident. Not because he's evil. I don't mean to paint all Christian preachers as evil, but because certainty doesn't usually sound cruel. It sounds comforting. It sounds polished. It sounds like someone who has all the answers. And that's exactly what makes it so persuasive. Now, let's play the next lyric.
Welcome, saints and stakeholders.
Here we see welcome saints and stakeholders. That may be my favorite line in the opening. I like it because it's funny. Now think about those two words, saints and stakeholders. One belongs to the language of the New Testament. The other belongs to the language of corporate management. And suddenly, without anybody noticing, church has quietly become a business or corporate meeting. Metrics, brand management, customer retention, public image, acceptable messaging, risk management. The goal slowly shifts, not from loving people, but from protecting the institution. Once institutions become sacred, people usually become expendable.
Please keep your doubts in the lobby. Compliance is next to godliness.
I think this may be the thesis statement of the entire album, because healthy faith doesn't fear questions. Healthy relationships don't fear questions. Healthy science doesn't fear questions. Healthy democracies don't fear questions. Only fragile systems need to control which questions are allowed to enter the discussion. Now, when I say this album is about religious trauma, I'm not talking about difficult doctrines. I'm talking about what happens when curiosity itself becomes morally suspect. When simply asking, how do we know that the Bible is inerrant? Or how do we know that Jesus really resurrected from the dead? Or how do we know that the canon of the 66 books of the Protestant Bible, as we have preferred for ourselves, is the true and correct and only right Bible? I mean, it's just an epistemologically responsible question to ask, how do we know what we think we know? But you see, in Christianity that I was raised in, that's interpreted as rebellion or sinful doubt. Now, looking back, I don't think I was afraid of hell nearly as much as I was afraid of asking the wrong question.
Compliance is next to godliness.
Compliance is next to godliness. You've probably heard the old saying, cleanliness is next to godliness. Well, the song twists it into something darker. Compliance. Why? Well, because high control religion often confuses obedience with conformity. Those aren't always the same thing. Obedience at its healthiest can be a thoughtful response to something you truly believe is good and true. Compliance is different. Compliance asks fewer questions and prioritizes fitting in over understanding. Compliance rewards agreement, whether that agreement is sincere or merely performed. Eventually, you don't just learn to trust what to believe, you learn which emotions are acceptable. And that becomes especially problematic when that is framed within gender stereotypes about how men are supposed to emote and feel as opposed to women, and we get into that binary type of thinking, like certain emotions are acceptable and not acceptable for men and vice versa for the women. Or you learn which books are acceptable, which friends are acceptable, which movies are acceptable, which political parties are acceptable, which parts of yourself are acceptable, until conformity and suppression become mistaken for holiness. Then comes the line that gives the song its title.
We are the infallible groove machine. Hallelujah.
We are the infallible groove machine. A groove is something a musician falls into. Once it's established, everything naturally follows it. You stop consciously thinking about every beat. Your body simply knows where it's supposed to land. Belief systems work much the same way. They create these cognitive grooves. And again, I'm speaking from experience and having been through therapy. Psychologists sometimes speak of schemas or mental models or cognitive frameworks, the patterns that our minds use to organize reality, or at least as we understand it. Those patterns can be tremendously helpful, but they can also become so familiar that we stop noticing their presence at all. Eventually, you stop examining your assumptions because they simply feel like reality. You're in the Truman Show. You're in Plato's cave. There is nothing outside there. So I call it the infallible groove machine, not because it actually is infallible, but because it has stopped imagining the possibility that it could ever be wrong. That's the danger. That's where I was at. That's not faith. That's not conviction. That is certainty without curiosity. Now, let's hear the choir. Hallelujah. The choir is celebrating without ever stopping to ask, what exactly are we celebrating? And history tells us human beings are remarkably capable of singing beautiful songs in service of terrible ideas. Music amplifies emotion. Community amplifies emotion. Certainty amplifies emotion. None of these things by themselves tell us whether an idea is true. And finally, the first command arrives.
Get the funk out.
Get the funk out. Hey. It's an excommunication. The machine has finally revealed how it protects itself, not by trying to answer the difficult questions, but rather by forcibly removing the people who ask those questions. You see, every high-control religious system has some version of this. Maybe it's formal church discipline. Maybe it's shunning. Maybe it's losing leadership roles. Or maybe it's being labeled rebellious. Maybe it's being called deceived. Now, the details might vary, but the pattern doesn't. The message is always remarkably similar. If your questions threaten our certainty, there's the door. And that's why the line here lands with a smile instead of a scream. Because exclusion rarely introduces itself as exclusion. It introduces itself as protecting the truth and securing its identity markers, usually under a persecution complex. That's why this album had to begin here. Not with my deconstruction, not with my doubts, not with my pain. It begins with the infallible groove machine underpinning it all. Because before I could understand why I left, I first had to understand those things that shaped me, beginning from a child. Now we go into verse 1, where I introduce us to Boy Blue, the character or archetype who represents repressive shame.
Got a smile from the pulpit, dress code in the air. Got a laminated gospel with a partisan prayer.
I think this verse does something really clever. Every line begins with got a or we got, so on and so forth. The machine isn't describing what it believes. It's inventorying what it possesses. You see, it owns the smile. It owns the dress code. It owns the gospel. It owns the metrics. It owns the charts. And it owns admission of what is acceptable and not into this community. Everything becomes something to be managed, if not micromanaged.
Yes, as I was saying, authority is performance, not truth.
I lean into that artistically because it subtly reinforces the corporate church motif without having to explain it outright.
Got a smile from the pulpit, dress code in the air.
Now we see verse 1 says, got a smile from the pulpit, dress code in the air. One thing I love about satire is that it exaggerates things just enough to make you suddenly realize it isn't exaggerating things very much at all. Now listen to what happens in just 4 lines. The machine begins making a list. We've got this, we've got that, we've got the systems covered. There's almost a smug confidence to it. Not confidence in God, but confidence in control, in managing the system. And that's an important distinction.
Got a smile from the pulpit.
Got a smile from the pulpit. Because smiles can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes a smile reflects genuine warmth. Sometimes it's hospitality. Sometimes it's joy. But sometimes a smile is part of the uniform. Every organization has one. The customer service smile, the politician's smile, the salesman's smile, the smile that says, everything's perfectly fine, nothing to see here, whether it is or not. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting every smiling pastor is putting on an act. And the lyric is not about individual sincerity. It's about systems. It's about asking a different question. Can a system learn to project warmth while quietly discouraging honesty? Those aren't the same thing. Sometimes the most difficult places to speak openly are also the friendliest places to visit, like church. Because everybody smiles while silently agreeing not to disturb the equilibrium or the status quo. Next lyric.
Dress code in the air.
Dress code in the air. Now notice, he doesn't say that there's a written dress code. It's simply in the air. That's how culture usually works. We breathe it in. Nobody necessarily has to hand us a rule book. You quietly absorb expectations, values, and belief systems, dogma, until they begin to feel less like ideas that you've inherited and more like the truths that you have always known. Such things as how you're supposed to dress, how you're supposed to vote, how loudly you're allowed to laugh, which books you're supposed to read, which movies you're supposed to watch and not supposed to watch, which words are acceptable, and which doubts should remain private. Sociologists sometimes distinguish between explicit rules and implicit norms. Explicit rules tend to be written down. Implicit norms are the unwritten expectations. You've heard of it's an unwritten law. Well, that's what we're talking about here. The unwritten expectations everyone somehow seems to know. In high control environments, those unwritten expectations can become just as powerful as official doctrine. Eventually, you stop asking whether you're being authentic. You instead ask, am I fitting in? Next.
Dress code in the air. Got a laminated gospel with a partisan prayer.
Got a laminated gospel with a partisan prayer. This may be one of my favorite images in the song because a laminated card can't be revised. Once you laminate something, you intend it pretty much to be permanent. It's finished. It's settled. I'm not making fun of people who have strong convictions. I have strong convictions. Strong convictions aren't the problem. The lyric asks a subtler question. What happens when our understanding of the gospel becomes so fixed that it can no longer be challenged or expanded? And then comes the second half with a partisan prayer.
Got a laminated gospel with a partisan prayer.
This isn't really about one political party. It's about what happens when politics becomes baptized. Whenever our tribe, our ideology, our cultural preferences become indistinguishable from the kingdom of God. History shows that temptation isn't unique to conservatives or liberals. Religious communities of many kinds have, at different times, wrapped partisan commitments in sacred or spiritual language. The lyric critiques that fusion itself, not suggesting one side has a monopoly on truth. Once that happens, every disagreement becomes more than disagreement. it becomes heresy. Because now you aren't arguing with me, you're arguing with God. And that's an incredibly powerful rhetorical move, and an incredibly dangerous one. Next,
We got metrics for the mercy, got a chart for the sin.
we've got metrics for the mercy. This line probably sums up my experience of high control religion better than any other. Metrics. Now let's think about that word. Metrics are useful. Businesses use metrics. Hospitals use metrics. Therapists use metrics. Schools use metrics. They're not inherently bad. The issue is not the use of metrics. But metrics can only measure certain kinds of things. You can measure attendance. You can measure giving. You can measure volunteer or work hours. You can measure baptisms. You can measure Bible reading plans. You can even measure doctrinal agreement. But can you measure compassion? Can you chart curiosity? Can you graph humility? Can you quantify whether someone is actually becoming more loving? Those are much harder. And because they're harder, institutions often gravitate toward measuring what is easiest to count, sometimes at the expense of what matters most. Next lyric.
We got metrics for the mercy, got a chart for the sin.
Got a chart for the sin. Now we move from metrics to management. Sin becomes categorized, ranked, color-coded, neatly organized, and before long, people begin to see themselves through spreadsheets rather than stories. Not tell me about your life, but which category do you fit in? The irony, of course, is that Jesus consistently complicated and expanded categories. He kept refusing to reduce people to mere labels. Tax collector, sinner, outcast, Samaritan. He kept turning the charts upside down. Next lyric.
You color outside the lines, we can't let you in.
If you color outside the lines. This line took me right back to kindergarten and my pink crayons while playing with Barbie in her pink Corvette. I was naturally bucking gendered stereotypes early in life without any knowledge or shame until religious indoctrination. Everybody knows what it feels like. You're handed a coloring page and you're told to stay within the lines, don't deviate, don't improvise, don't experiment, don't make the sky green or the grass purple. Blue is for boys, pink is for girls. Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. One man, one woman for life. That's traditional marriage based on biblical values. So on and so forth, like that. Religion can sometimes function that way. Not always, but many times, as in my experience. It offers certainty and delusion at the price of curiosity or imagination. Questions become dangerous. Nuance becomes suspicious. Complexity becomes uncomfortable. And eventually, your own conscience begins asking permission before it speaks, suppressed and numbed by years of gaslighting. Next lyric.
You color outside the lines, we can't let you in.
We can't let you in. And there it is. The first gate, the first boundary, the first condition for belonging. Now notice what determines admission. Not kindness, not honesty, not integrity, not compassion, conformity. That's it. If your coloring doesn't match ours, you don't belong here. And that's precisely the logic of the infallible groove machine. And once belonging depends on perfect alignment, people learn something incredibly quickly. I'd better hide the parts of myself that don't fit the picture. For me, that's one of the deepest wounds religious trauma can leave behind, and so did for me. Recovery requires a lot of integrative shadow work to disentangle the mess, as I know from personal experience. It's not that you simply fear being wrong. It's that you begin fearing being fully known, because somewhere along the way you learned that acceptance was in fact conditional. Not on who you were, but on how well you stayed or colored inside the lines. And that, I think, is where deconstruction actually begins, or began for me. Not when someone loses their faith, but when they become finally exhausted from coloring someone else's damn picture. If you'd like to continue this journey, Feel free to subscribe as we work through every song on the Proud Heretic album, one lyric, one domino, one story, one layer of deconstruction at a time. Thanks for your time and attention to this episode, and keep asking better questions. Peace.
Welcome, saints and stakeholders. Please keep your doubts in the lobby. Compliance is next to godliness. We are the infallible groove machine. Hallelujah. Get the funk out. Get the funk out. Hey! 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 Get the funk out. Hey! Got a smile from the pulpit. Dress code in the air. Got a laminated gospel with the partisan prayer. We got metrics for the mercy, got a chart for the sin. If you color outside the lines, we can't let you in.